phenomena of fascism, as we have had occasion to discuss elsewhere, was essentially a middle-class reaction to two sorts of developments in the wake of the Great War. On the one hand, there was the weakness of liberal democratic regimes. On the other hand, there was the ascendancy of socialism that was threatening the middle class with a kind of status anxiety. The quintessential form, in fact the original form of fascism that we come to see happened in Italy in the wake of the end of the Great War. To understand the story of the emergence of fascism, one has to understand the immediate context in which the phenomenon began to take shape in Italy. At the time of the end of the Great War, Italy had experienced electoral politics for a period of well over 50 years. Nevertheless, because of some structural peculiarities of Italian state, the roots of democracy, the institutional roots of democracy were not very strong. When it was unified under the leadership of people like Count Emilio Cavour, was bringing together a country that had effectively two different sorts of economy. There was the industrial north and there was the agricultural south, alongside a huge number of cities that were driven primarily around commerce. The disparate economies of the northern and southern parts of Italy, when they were brought together not because of any surge of democratic pressure from below, although that was there in the mainframe of the movement of the Risorgimento, the Italian nationalist movement. The real thrust for Italian unification, or let's say a very powerful thrust for Italian unification, had actually come from the top. So the political order that came into being in Italy from the moment of its independence was that of a managerial order rather than a democratic order from below. And in the first 50 years leading on to the First World War, Italian politics used to be dominated by the Liberal Party, which had been founded at one point of time by Count Emilio Cavour. The politics of Italy under the liberal era of the first 50 years was characterized by a phenomenon known as transformismo, which basically meant that whenever the parliament was to throw up any form of opposition to the liberal government, that party of opposition, that force of opposition, would be transformed into something like a member of a coalition government. So whenever a dissident voice, a dissident party emerged within the liberal Italian body politic, the liberal government would accommodate it, would give it some position in the government and create a broad ministerial front, as it were. As a result, for a period of over 50 years, there were no effective changes in government. The Liberal Party continued to dominate the political landscape, bringing in new faces from time to time. Policy-wise changes were never very dynamic. The inevitable repercussion of this was that there was no real change of government, only changes in the faces. As a result, that democratic politics could shape the lives of people in a better way, it was not an idea that Italians were very conversant with. Italian politics remained the politics of managerialism. The government moved from one crisis to another, managing one crisis to another. The real changes, if there were any to take place, could happen only at the level of the locality, where it was possible to come up with alternative programs, which is the reason why there were other parties that could successfully emerge, such as the Popolari, which was a papist Christian nationalist formation, or even that of the socialists, which had begun to emerge with the rise of social democracy in the 1890s. At the turn of the war, Italy was therefore a liberal democratic order in which there was very little of liberalism and very little of democracy. It was, one could say, a guided democracy. The real challenge, therefore, came with the dislocation brought about by the First World War. Now, in the First World War, Italy had joined the side of the Triple Entente, meaning it aligned with Britain and France and Russia against Austria-Hungary and Germany, hoping to get compensated by means of spoils of war in terms of imperial locations in Africa, as also a part of the Dalmatian Peninsula, which is right next to Italy along the Adriatic Sea. Once the war came to a close, Italy was disappointed because the Peace of Paris and the Versailles Treaty did not give Italy anything resembling what it was looking for. So there was a feeling of national hurt, that the Italian national sensibilities had been hurt because places on the Dalmatian Peninsula where a large number of Italians lived were not allowed to be merged with the Kingdom of Italy, nor was Italy allowed to sort of spread its imperial possessions in Africa. So Italy came out of the First World War as an aggrieved party. And one of the reasons that was identified why Italy failed to gain anything out of the Paris Peace Conference was the weakness of the liberal government in terms of its diplomatic achievements. Italy did not have any phenomenal resources the kind Germany had or Austria-Hungary, even Austria-Hungary had. Italy was comparatively a resource-poor country. When it went into the war, it therefore fought the war essentially by means of deficit financing. That is to say, it printed money in order to make good the costs of war. When the war came to a close, therefore, there was a steep inflationary pressure that the Italian currency was beginning to witness. The government tried to resolve this question by immediately cutting public expenditure in almost an archetypal trajectory for the rise of fascism. So on the one hand, food prices were rising, prices generally were rising across the board. On the other hand, the government was unable to help out the people in any way because it was also insistent upon cutting its own expenditure. Now, the people who had gone into the war, when they were coming back into a demobilized economy, they suddenly found that either the jobs that they previously held were not there, being taken over by other people during the war, or they were coming into an economy which was not functioning as properly as it should, meaning the wages were not rising as fast as food prices, and given the inflationary pressure, this was making life very difficult. So there was a great deal of resentment, a great deal of disquiet that the liberal democratic regime in Italy, the government, was facing. This coincided with the socialist challenge that plagued northern Italy, and this was predominantly a northern Italian phenomenon. The industrial working class had played a major role in whatever little war effort that Italy had to generate. So when at the end of the war they were rewarded with a freeze on their wages and rise in prices, the socialist movement in Italy managed to mobilize a large segment of the Italian working class in demand for higher wages. And given the failure of the liberal movement, the socialists began then to project the Bolshevik alternative of redistribution of agrarian resources alongside nationalization of industrial resources, and this option began to appear attractive to a large number of the Italian underclass. So the same circumstances in which fascism began to emerge elsewhere in Europe in the 1920s, Italy was beginning to witness this as early as 1918-1919. The Italian middle class was therefore aggrieved that its nationalist sentiments had been hurt. It was aggrieved that the liberal democratic government was not up to any good, and it was resentful of the fact that the socialists were becoming more assertive, and therefore they were challenging the relative ascendancy of the Italian bourgeoisie. The string of developments in the beginning in 1920 that led eventually to the rise of fascism as a political force in Italian politics has to be situated in this particular context. A large number of middle class Italians who had diverse political orientations. There were people who were monarchists, there were people who were republicans, came together with a sense of disquiet, a sense of unease at the manner in which a political vacuum seemed to be emerging in post-war Italy. Led by the very curious character called Benito Mussolini, these people formed what were known as the squadres de azione, the action squads, which are basically fascistic fighting leagues to contest socialism on the streets of Italy. Comprised primarily of middle class veterans of the First World War who had been brutalized and who had been sort of given a propensity towards violence by the experience of war. These were people determined to fight the socialists on the streets, and the combat leagues, the fighting leagues that the fascists began to group together were trying to promote the middle class resistance. The industrialists who were uncomfortable with growing socialist militancy began to look towards such fascist squads. Benito Mussolini turned out to be the most curious character to lead such a group, because he was himself at one point of time considered to be a socialist, used to edit the socialist journal called Avanti. But in the wake of the end of the Great War and in the wake of the socialist challenge posed by the Italian socialist movement, Benito Mussolini gradually distanced himself from the Socialist Party and tried to mobilize a middle class resistance toward the working class militancy. In 1919 and 1920, Socialist Party tried to mobilize the working class, tried to mobilize the trade unions, and had taken out a number of demonstrations, chanting slogans and fighting forces of order in order to place their demand for a higher wage and a better standard of living on a much more higher pitch. And the liberal government was unable to do anything about this because its political power had been reduced dramatically by the elections of 1919. The Liberal Party had been reduced from over 400 seats to 200 in the parliament. But what was more important, that the socialist representation in the Italian parliament had risen almost 3 times, from 52 seats before the war to 56 seats in 1919. What was still more alarming for the Italian middle class was that the socialists were doing much better in solving the local problems, not required to sort of coordinate their moves with the Liberal Party at the center. The socialists were better able to solve problems to do with municipal hygiene and municipal health and even education at the municipal levels. So a large segment of northern Italian municipalities went over to the ways of the socialists. And once the socialists were in power, once socialists were able to appoint their own mayors, political demonstration led by socialists in a municipality dominated by socialists was unlikely to be molested by forces of law and order, by the police in any serious way. So in the small towns of northern Italy, and even in some big industrial towns like Milan, like Ferrara, there was the specter of socialist takeover of politics, very real. And the prospect of a Bolshevik type revolution, although it was never considered seriously by even the Italian socialists, began to plague the Italian middle class. And Benito Mussolini, bringing about a wide body of activists like Olivetti, like Balbo, managed to piece together a platform of fascists who were divided in their political orientation, but were united in combating the socialist insurgency. By 1920, the effectiveness of the fascist fighting leagues in beating back working class militancy, in breaking strikes, and sometimes even proactively breaking up socialist demonstrations and political party meetings, made the liberal government in Rome consider the possibility of inducting Mussolini somehow in their broad ministerial front. So in 1921, determined to use the fascists and therefore to accommodate them in some way, the liberals sort of reached out to Benito Mussolini, hoping that Mussolini would be able to do what the police were failing to do in containing socialist expansion. In 1921, an election was held in which Mussolini and the fascists managed to corner 35 seats, which, if you would put it into the perspective of the Italian parliament, was absolutely nothing. It was just around 6 or 7% of all the seats, with the Liberal Party holding over 200 seats, the Socialists around 150, and the Popolari, the Catholic Nationalist Party, holding something like 100 seats. Mussolini's 35 was no good. A broad coalition was therefore formed, keeping the socialists out and embracing just about everyone else. The former Italian Prime Minister, having failed to tackle socialist militancy, Giovanni Giolitti, had to go. And Mussolini became one of the principal supporters of the government in 1921. But after a time, seeing the inability of the Italian liberals to do much good in contesting the socialist militancy, Mussolini pulled out. Once Giolitti's government collapsed, there was a new coalition, a weaker coalition led by Facta, with the liberals and the Popolari coming together. But even this government was not very frightfully strong. So the instability that had marked the rise of fascism in 1919-1920 was only getting more and more accentuated. It was also a time, however, when the fascists were able to mobilize much greater support. The stronger socialists grew, the stronger was the middle class reaction in favor of Mussolini. So between 1921 and 1924, Mussolini gradually became a player in Italy's municipal politics. To be fair, there were many in the fascist movement at this point of time who were not were able to see eye to eye with Mussolini on a large number of issues. In 1921, for instance, Mussolini tried a kind of reconciliation pact with the socialists, as a result of which the fascist attack on socialist mobilization would stop. But people like Balbo and Olivetti, who were anti-socialist, if they were anything, they resisted. And Mussolini had to let them go. Between 1921 and 1924, therefore, Mussolini's hold on the fascist movement was not among the strongest, because the principal force came from fascists at the municipal level in contesting socialism. So at a time when the fascist appeal was growing in public perception, Mussolini's personal appeal did not seem to gain much. Towards the end of 1923, however, the liberal Popolari government under Facta was becoming even more disappointing than the Giolitti government had earlier been. So in 1924, Mussolini, in a bid to unite the fascists regardless of their political orientations, tried to do something very bold. Mussolini could see that the situation in Italy was beckoning an adventurer, and he was bold enough to embark on this adventure. In October 1924, he gave out the call for fascists from across Italy to march on Rome. As fascists from all over Italy began to converge on Rome, Mussolini, very interestingly, was ready in a railway compartment on a train bound for France to leave for France the moment he realized that the government was going to crack down on fascists. Mussolini was uncertain which way the march on Rome would go, and he was perfectly willing to fly into exile to France should things go wrong. But as it happened, the march on Rome, which was accompanied with a call for the king, Victor Emmanuel, that Mussolini should be appointed prime minister, was heeded very curiously by the Italian political establishment. The political establishment could see that the socialist mobilization was growing so strong and the Facta government was so ineffective that it needed forceful handling. And if the fascists were inducted into the government, into a broad ministerialist front, then it might be possible to bring some kind of semblance of control against the socialist menace. So it was with this aim in mind that upon the march on Rome, which was basically a bluff by Mussolini, the Italian government failed to call the bluff, and they invited Mussolini instead to come to Rome and help form the government. So Mussolini, seated on a train bound for the frontier of France, had his journey diverted instead to come to Rome and become prime minister of the Italian government. From 1924, when he was appointed the head of a minority government, fascist-led minority government with only around 35 seats, to 1929, when the fascist party was the ruling party, the transition of Benito Mussolini and the fascist movement was a very interesting one. Once appointed prime minister, Mussolini began to use the structures of the state to subvert the old order and bring into being his new order. To start with, there was an inclusion of liberal and populari politicians in the government that Mussolini formed. But between 1924 and 29, systematic purges were undertaken of the administrative apparatus of anyone even remotely resembling a socialist sympathizer. So the municipal councils that had been won by the socialists were unable to function because the bureaucrats were now being strongly discouraged from obliging them. Secondly, the socialist politicians who were in charge of the various municipalities were ignominiously displaced and were replaced by hand-picked officials to run the municipal government of Italy. The purge of the administration at the municipal level was then followed by purges at the level of the central government, and even in some cases interference with the judiciary. So judges who had been sympathetic to the socialists were gradually eased out, and the judiciary was occasionally directed from time to time as to what sort of line to take vis-a-vis the government. The real reason, however, why Mussolini was able to pull all of this off was the fact that at one stage in 1929, Mussolini went ahead and signed the Concordat with the Pope. Till 1929, the Pope in Vatican was unwilling to accept the legitimacy of the government in Rome. Mussolini, by reaching out to the Pope, despite coming from a very strong anti-clerical background, was able to diffuse a strong current of Catholic, rural Catholic opposition that had existed to the fascist movement. So when the Concordat with the Pope was signed, the Pope accepted the legitimacy of the Italian government led by Benito Mussolini. The Christian nationalists of the southern part of Italy, predominantly agricultural, found it easier to accept the fascist regime in the municipal and in the central levels. Gradually, therefore, some very interesting developments began to take place. The Italian fascist movement remained numerically considerably smaller than what proportionally the Nazi movement had turned out to be. There was a very deliberate attempt by Mussolini to reduce or to keep the total strength of the fascist party as a whole to a very small size. And although a large number of intellectuals were willing to come forth and play ball with Mussolini, Mussolini never inducted them into the party. He was willing to accept support for the fascist ideology from the outside. In 1929, a law was passed because Mussolini could see that ultimately he was never going to win the majority of Italians' votes. A law was passed, an electoral reform was passed by which it was decided that since no party was going to make past the 50% seats mark, anyone who won the largest number of seats would automatically be given a majority in the parliament, which basically meant whether the people voted for a major party to the extent of giving them a majority or not, one party or the other would get the majority seats in the parliament. And because Mussolini was in the charge of the government, it had to be the fascist party. The reason, however, why this system survived well into the 30s was because of the policy of economic corporatism that Mussolini introduced, a kind of national syndicalism. Having once been a socialist at one point of time, but leading a party of middle class, right-wing reactionary forces on the other, Mussolini brought into being an economic ideology that brought representatives of entrepreneurs and representatives of labor together to tackle the economic crisis that was being posed by the Great Depression. So from 1930 onwards, Italian industrial and agricultural economy began to be coordinated by representatives of industry and representatives of labor, with some amount of guidance from the state itself. And it is this fascist, nationalist, syndicalist tendency of creating a kind of corporate state where the state dictates or at least gives a guiding hand in the running of economy, which managed to diffuse, it managed to cushion a lot of the pains that the depression would otherwise have generated among the Italians. So at a time when Italians were actually being deprived of their democratic privileges of electing their own government and dislodging them if possible, the Italians settled instead for a controlled, regulated economy, not controlled, regulated economy, with middle class preoccupations of private property being adequately addressed, and also the worst effects of the depression not hitting them. It is primarily because of this reason, despite ruling over a much more weaker state apparatus than what Hitler did in Germany, the fascist movement in Italy more or less went into the war rising sort of a political tide before the Second World War and association with Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany came to break it.